What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Mindset Cafe podcast. As always, it's your host, Devin Gonzalez, and today we got a special journey to help you guys on your own journey. And this guest that we're going to be bringing on today, he has had a little bit different career path, right? He hasn't started as a traditional entrepreneur like a lot of the guests that we've had on this podcast, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to bring him on and really explore what made him think, of transitioning the way he did without ruining too much. But I want to thank so much for Armando Azarloza for coming on the podcast today. Before we get into everything that you're currently doing, it's my understanding that you started in politics, right? Like, how did your career path start before we go into like the entrepreneurial space?
Yeah. Hey, Devin. Good to be with you today. I think I took a little bit of a different path, really, in some cases. I mean, I graduated from college and I didn't jump into entrepreneurship or owning a business. I actually decided to take a different track, which was going into politics. So I got a degree in political science from UCLA. Studied Latin American studies and comparative governments. And so my passion was always politics. I grew up in a Cuban American household where politics was a big part of our kind of everyday discussion. So it seemed like a natural progression for me to kind of take on that kind of a career path. So started working in political campaigning, and then ultimately ended up in DC. And then that kind of spurred on my interest in my overall interest in communications and marketing. And then that ultimately led me into what I do today. But the foundation of everything that I start with is really from my days in politics.
And with you in politics, I mean, you grew up with my dad and everything, and that's how we were
Yeah,
introduced. Um, you know, from your guys' childhood and stuff, you guys went, obviously both into government jobs and stuff like that. What
yeah.
led you to, I know you studied it in college and stuff, but what led you to want to pursue politics? Was there something that happened in your life, or what appeased you in that, manner?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think similar to your dad's family history and my family history. My our families were lived in Cuba, in the 50s and the 40s and 50s and 60s. Come 1959, there was a communist revolution on the island. My father was very involved in a lot of the anti-Castro organized movement in the early 60s. Was involved with the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, and worked with American security interests to try to change the system and to bring back freedom and liberties to the island. After a number of years of doing that and actually being a political prisoner in Cuba, it got to the point where he and my family left Cuba. And then started a new life outside of the island, always with the hope to try to return. But that, 60 years later, we're still in the United States, and thankfully, we are in the United States. But I think that kind of background, family background, really kind of instilled my interest, my passion for politics. Certainly, issues around Cuba are very important to me. But growing up in the United States, I became very passionate about the system that we have here in the country, and to try to help support the more conservative wing of politics in American society, to try to fight off any kind of socialist movement in the country, and to try to bring back some kind of common sense rationality to our debates. So I think it all has to do with family history. I know you guys got the same family history on your dad's side, and I think that makes us much more appreciative of what we have here in the country today, much more of advocates for freedom and liberty. So that really is the foundation for my start in politics, and then ultimately the foundation for what I do today.
That's awesome. It's crazy to think about because I've heard stories from, my grandpa, my abuelo, like my dad was too young to really remember, but the stories of bringing your entire family here, right, and only having a few dollars or $100 to your name and trying to figure it out, it's I can't even fathom that risk taking, and the opportunities that they've created for us and the generations, after them. It's crazy
Hmm.
to think about. Um, do you think your family, like taking that leap, has made you even more motivated to pursue your dreams? Almost like if you didn't, you would be taking it at you'd be taking for granted their risk, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that all of us that come over to this country, whether it's, coming from a communist country like we did, or, coming across from a different country because you want better economic opportunities, I mean, you kind of instill that dream into the minds of the next generation. So, I frankly think that if I'm not successful at what I do, if I don't take advantage of the opportunities that have been presented to me, I'm going to be wasting the sacrifice that my parents made. I mean, they could have stayed in Cuba. Obviously, that wasn't, something they wanted necessarily to do under that system that, kind of canceled them and canceled their point of view and their livelihood. But and decided to come here. So if we don't take advantage of those opportunities while we're here, I mean, shame on us, frankly, because they've sacrificed everything to give us that chance. And so I feel, very much committed to the idea that we have to do a little bit better than the past generation. And I hope that my daughters, take that as well and say, well, I have to do a little bit better than my dad's generation because we've been given this unique opportunity, and we need to figure out how to defend that opportunity at every cost because it's a unique experience for us. It's a unique experience for our community, and one, frankly, that has, I think, enriched our lives, beyond the reasonable doubt.
No, I'm so in alignment with that. And I mean, from what I've known and heard that will go into it with your things that you created, you're setting the bar pretty high, for your daughters to try to overcome, and that's awesome. That's not, anything to knock. It's one of those things where I hope my daughter does outdo the things that I'm able to do, right? Um,
Yeah.
so tying into some of the stuff that you're doing, you got into politics. What was that shift? Because now you're into marketing, and we'll go into like the marketing with South America and Latin
hmm
countries and stuff. But what was that shift, or what was that point where you realized that you were just kind of done with politics?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I'm ever done with politics. I mean, it's still very much a passion point for me, and it's still something that I'm actually very involved in. I mean, I help out, political candidates across the country whenever possible. I've been involved with a couple of presidential elections and a couple of, congressional races and up and down the state of California. So it's still a passion point that I have, and it's something that's very, very important to me. And frankly, it's something that I enjoy. Once it's in your blood, it's kind of in your blood. So it's just something you have to kind of do. But I got to the point, in my life where I wanted to kind of explore some of the creative passion that I had with respect to marketing and advertising. When I say I was in politics, I was in politics, but on the communication side as opposed to the legislative side. So I wasn't really kind of the person coming up with laws or policy making. I was really the one that was helping communicate, the value of those laws or that particular initiative to the electorate. So it seemed like a natural extension for me to take what I did in politics for elected officials and for, legislative priorities and to put them to work, for corporations and brand building. And I frankly took a lot of the lessons that I learned in politics and I simply applied them to our corporate clients. And it kind of was a little bit of a different shift for many of our clients. I mean, they hadn't actually kind of seen the political wheel that I brought to the table. And as such, I think that has really kind of propelled our business, and I think given our clients an opportunity to, I think, to score big with their consumers. So it's not a huge lift or shift from what I was doing before. I just switched out an elected official for a particular brand.
I know, and that's crazy that you had that realization that, or that understanding that essentially what you're doing with in communicating with the communities and stuff with the elected officials, or with the, whatever you're trying to basically communicate to the community, and realizing that you can do that same thing with brands. All you're doing is replacing the X factor, because a lot of people won't kind of shift their mindset if they're like, I'm in politics, this is what I'm doing, and they're not realizing that the skills and tools that you're developing, the communicational skills, are transverse across different industries, different things. um, so what was that first stepping stone when you transitioned, and wanted to start, doing marketing and focusing on branding?
Yeah, so when I made the decision that I wanted to do this, I had my first step was to try to figure out how to pivot, and I pivoted to an agency that actually handled what we call issues campaigns, right? So we weren't marketing that bottle of water that you just drank, right? I mean, we weren't looking at how to push Hershey's or how to push General Motors. We were looking at how to push issues that people were interested in, right? So we did a lot of work in healthcare, for example, at the very beginning, and that afforded me the opportunity to kind of slowly kind of ease into some of the corporate branding work that I ultimately do through the eyes of issues and strategic communication. So it wasn't a huge kind of like pivot. It was just kind of a slight pivot to be able to adjust to who we were representing. But a lot of the foundation was foundation work that I did in politics, and I just simply applied it to healthcare, for example. In that particular case, we also became advocates, for energy policy. So it was a very kind of simple kind of pivot at that point. My career then later took on a different pivot, which pivoted to major brands, and major U.S. corporations that were just pushing a product, building a brand, trying to increase market share. So that's a little bit of a different. But my first easy pivot was just turn my head and look at issues and figure out how I could help companies kind of drive issues and public opinion, shift public opinion, drive new behaviors for a particular company and a particular policy.
Wow, that's awesome. Did There was a marketing term that I heard recently. So was that kind of like counterculture marketing you were utilizing? Is that something that you were doing with those policy things before the branding, or is that something completely different?
Yeah, no, that's a little bit different. I mean, I think what we were doing is really shaping public opinion, right? So, just like you shape public opinion for a political candidate, to see things the way they see it, to vote for them in order to support your legislative, priorities to represent you in DC. We were doing the same thing. We were working with, companies that wanted to shift public opinion around a particular issue. So healthcare was one of the issues that we got involved in very early on, and it was kind of helping educate and inform people about some of the healthcare changes that were happening in the country. And as such, it really became just a kind of a very easy pivot for me because instead of advocating for a legislative priority, I was advocating for energy policy or for healthcare policy that was going to be coming down the pike. So it was a little bit of a different situation. It wasn't some of the marketing work that I do today. So, one of the things I always tell a lot of folks that, kind of are entrepreneurs that own their own businesses, you got to be ready to pivot at any time, right? The idea that the business plan that you wrote at the very beginning of your career is going to drive your overall direction for the next 20, 25 years, 30 years. That's just, it's unrealistic. I mean, business owners have to pivot. They have to explore different revenue streams. They have to explore different ways to market their business, market themselves. And so it was for me at least, it was an easy way to kind of get into it, and then that ultimately later drove me into the next pivot, the next chapter, which was much more brand and corporate work.
With your brand and corporate work, do you feel that you've been able to utilize any of the, not political, but well, maybe political or like cultural means to basically, help build that brand's image, or kind of like
Yeah.
twist basically what you were doing before, give it a little twist and basically emphasize a brand on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that we always do in politics is research, right? I mean, research is the fundamental first step that you take when you actually begin to kind of form a political campaign, right? You got to research the issues, you have to research your candidate, you have to research your opponent, you have to research your voters and the community and what they feel. And so we brought some of that kind of research focused ideas to our campaigns. And so a lot of times where some of my clients didn't actually use research as often as they should have, we insisted that we do the research, right? So it's not just enough to feel what's in my gut or to throw something against the wall and hopefully it sticks. My view was before we go out there and spend millions of dollars, let's go out there and do some research. Let's do some focus group. Let's do some quantitative surveys, and let's figure out exactly where we are in the marketplace. How do we shift opinion? How do we drive people to your product? How do you ultimately engage these people? What are they looking for? And so that came from my political days because it was just politics 101. If you don't get the research right at the very beginning, you're not going to get your activation or your mobilization right throughout the campaign.
Well, that's awesome. was it a transition, or did you have to transition your mindset in the way you communicated with, let's say, a CEO, or let's say a corporate individual versus someone that you were dealing with in politics, or when you were dealing with just like the legislative issues like healthcare and stuff like that? Did you have to notice your did you're good. Did you have to notice that you had to shift the way you were approaching, each kind of person or each individual industry? And what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I think as when you pivot into a new area, you have to understand that you might have to kind of pivot your approach, and you might have to kind of adjust, how you advocate and how you speak with people, and how you convince people. I mean, I spend a lot of my time every day educating people about the U.S. Hispanic market, right? So that was like my third pivot, if you will. My third pivot was to focus almost exclusively on the U.S. Hispanic market. I felt, from the very beginning that this was an underserved market, that people weren't really paying attention to the U.S. Hispanics. Back in 2000, we began to see the growth of the market, and people were predicting this amazing growth. Well, that amazing growth, you can multiply that by 20, and maybe you're getting close to where it ultimately is today, right? The growth has been incredible. The U.S. Hispanic market is growing at about 4 to 5 times larger and faster than the general market, the white market, if you will, in the United States. So it was a huge business opportunity, I thought, for many of my clients that weren't really kind of tapping into that market. But then that made me become an advocate for the market. I had to be a champion, an advocate. I had to evangelize the market so that my clients understood what the opportunity was. And so I had to address the market in different ways. Where in politics, you have to kind of decipher the market and figure out how you're going to play in that market. Well, now in the work that I do, I have to educate people about the potential of the market. So I had to take a step back, educate them, inform them, have them become strong advocates for the market, and then come back, and then we can figure out exactly how to reach the Hispanic market, whether it's in English or in Spanish, or whether it's through television or radio or digital or even community engagement, whatever the tactic might be. Once you had that strategy and you believed in the marketplace, then you had the foundation for a winning campaign.
What do you think was more difficult, or if there was a more difficult one, dealing with, like, because you have your marketing campaign, you have your research, right, for both, whether it's politics, legislation like healthcare, or for brands, but dealing with the political side or politicians, or dealing with like brand corporate executives, who do you think has given you a little bit more run for your money?
Yeah, I think I've got a lot more gray hair working with corporate brand leaders, to be perfectly honest, because sometimes I see the opportunity in front of me. I carve out for them how to approach it, and sometimes, in many cases, they heed the advice and move forward, and in other cases, frankly, they just kind of put their head in the sand and don't make the proper investment. So I think I've grown more gray hair with some of these corporate leaders than I had with a lot of the elected officials, because the elected officials that I worked with, you know, largely, were strong believers in their legislative agenda. They had an understanding of what they had to do in order to be able to win elections, and how to get legislation passed through Congress. And so there wasn't a lot of like convincing, if you will. It was just a matter of helping them, reinforcing them, and figuring out how to become an advocate for it. But in the work that I do today, I'm really kind of an evangelist. I spend a lot of time educating people, and some people just don't want to be educated, don't believe in the market, think that they're doing enough. And the reality is they're never doing it enough. And frankly, if you look at some of the statistics, you'll see that companies that invest in the Hispanic market, return shareholder value at a much larger and faster rate than those that don't. So the statistics prove me out. It's just a matter of getting these, corporate CEOs to put their support and to prioritize the market. And I think we're seeing a lot more today than we were, 20 years ago. But there's still a long way to go and a lot more opportunity out there.
Wow, that's interesting. So what are you doing now with, I know with the brands and everything like that, is it a fourth transition? I know my dad was mentioning, and we talked about a little bit the other day about it. Your involvement with the South America, or Latino countries,
Hmm.
is that
Yeah, most of my work, I've done work for what I call Latin American countries chasing the Hispanic consumer, right? So there are companies that are in Mexico and other parts of Latin America that are very familiar with a lot of the newly arrived, the new immigrants here in the United States, right? And so those companies have seen the opportunity to kind of continue marketing to them across the border. So whether you're marketing to them in Mexico or Central America, you're now marketing and telling them the same thing in the United States because those products are available on U.S. shelves, if you will. They're available in the United States. But my work primarily is U.S. focused. I mean, my work, I'd say 90% or 80% of my work is really about U.S. companies that are looking for the opportunity to engage the Hispanic consumer in a thoughtful, meaningful conversation about what's important to them, what's important to their families, and how do we alter our products? How do we create new offerings that are going to speak to that Hispanic lifestyle? I often have often had the question, what can we sell to Hispanics? And I say, well, shit, you could sell anything you want to Hispanics. I mean, from razor blades to soap to deodorant to motor oil. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. Hispanics buy and consume everything at a huge clip rate. In fact, we over-index in many products when you compare it to the Anglo or the white market. So it's just a matter of educating people about those things and really becoming your own evangelist.
So what you're saying too is it's about the pitch, right? And it's about like the image that you're portraying to the market itself, right? How you would pitch to one culture or one demographic isn't necessarily going to be the same as what it traditionally has been if you're trying to, maximize the Latino market or the Hispanic market, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not one market. I mean, that's one of the that what you just said is it was one of the main issues that I try to press on people. It's not just one market. Even though if you look at the U.S. Hispanic market today, it's about 70% Mexican. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use, a Mexican approach, if you will, to every single product because that might work here in California. But if you go to Florida or you go to New York or New Jersey, you're going to have to alter your perspective because there you have more of a Caribbean influence, right? Cuban, Puerto Rican, Dominican, and even though we speak the language, we have similar, family values. There are some differences between Mexicans and Cubans. I'm sure you know that. And so I think that's one of the first things I tell people is just not just one size fits all. It's not one approach. You have to tailor your message to that specific audience and be focused on the local sensibility of each individual market across the United States. I mean, even the Mexican market, if you look at California and then you look at Texas, Texas has a much more of a second, third generation Mexican community versus California, where in California, it's a lot of immigrant communities from Central America and from Mexico. And so you got to treat those communities different because the Tejano in Texas has been here for 100 years. And so they've assimilated into American culture much more than those that just came over the last, 5 or 10 years from Latin America. So it's a different approach. There's some similarities, but it's a different approach, and you have to tailor your business to be able to meet that demand.
So when you're saying it's a different approach, are you talking about like the visuals, the context,
Mhm.
like, or both?
Both.
Um,
Yeah,
because
I think it's both. I think it's the visual, right? You want to be able to provide people, you want to be able to put people in position that look like those communities, right? When you decide, okay, what's my passion? One of the things we do in marketing is you figure out what your passion point is, right? So your passion point, let's say for sake of discussion, if you're talking to Mexican Americans, it might be soccer, because I know there's a very big fan base of soccer with Mexican Americans. Now, if you go to Miami, you're probably not going to really push soccer as much. You might want to push baseball more because Caribbean Hispanics are more fans of baseball than they are of soccer. So the passion point is different, and so while there are lots of similarities in the language and in how we raise our families and why we all came here, how you actually begin and explore that conversation with people is a little bit different. And so you have to be cognitive, you have to be sensitive to that sensibility.
well, that's awesome that you've realized that too. Because I mean, it's true. My wife is, 100%, Mexican, and that her family is huge in soccer, right? And growing up, like I know my grandparents and everything were more into baseball and everything like that. So that makes 100% sense. one thing I've also noticed, and you kind of touched on it too, is like with the context, right? With Mexican Spanish versus Cuban Spanish, that I've personally seen the difference in certain words. Like one word might not mean the same thing in both languages. Do you
Right.
find yourself having to tailor any advertising or campaigns that are written in Spanish, or be aware of that, or do you kind of just do a universal Spanish for most ads?
No, I mean, I think for the most part, you try to make ads as universal as possible, but you also are aware that there are these local sensibilities, right? I mean, Mexican Americans say things in ways that are different than Cuban Americans. And so if you're doing a campaign that's, focused on California or the western part of the United States, you're gonna try to kind of, defer to that kind of Mexican American lingo. Versus if you're doing something on the East Coast where there are fewer Mexicans, and you're going to say, well, I'm going to kind of make it more Caribbean in nature because it's going to be able to speak to them to that reality. I think you throw in here's another component that you have to consider as well. Hispanics today are speaking less Spanish and more English, right? So if you're a U.S. born Hispanic and you grow up in the United States as a young child, you go to American schools, you're gonna speak English perfectly, or you should speak English perfectly. It doesn't mean that you stop speaking Spanish, because when you go home, your abuela or your grandfather or your cousin, your tia, is going to ask you to speak, in Spanish perhaps. And so there is this kind of blending of language that takes place. And so the marketing has to try to reflect that. One of the things that we're seeing more and more today is bilingual ads. So an ad that kind of bridges the gap between two languages. So if you've got a younger person in the commercial, that person might be speaking in English to somebody else, but then the aunt or the grandfather might be speaking in Spanish. And so that's our new reality as Hispanic Americans, is that there is a kind of, the Spanglish that takes place where we speak English and Spanish. And I know, like your dad and I, when we get together, we flip back and forth English and Spanish because we have the ability to kind of go from one to the other. We're Cuban Americans, but we grew up in the United States. We largely speak English, but it's very easy for us to transition right back into Spanish. It's just part of our natural way of being. So the marketing has to reflect that. And so that's another component that we have to realize, is the market is also pivoting, it's evolving. And so the marketing has to evolve as a result of that.
Wow. I mean, it's it's amazing that you've realized that, because I mean that's my daily life, and I would have never even thought about that, right? Like you said, you and my dad, when you guys talk, you guys flip back and forth. My household with my dad growing up, it was all English based, and then I would have the Spanish based with my grandparents and stuff, but I'd only really speak English. And I've been getting better at Spanish because my wife and her family, but my reality is that Spanglish. My mother-in-law will speak to me in Spanish and I'll respond in English, kind of
Yeah.
thing. So it's one of those things where I never even thought to tailor ads like that, because that's outside the box kind of thinking, but that is the reality, and it relates to so many people these days. That's
Yeah,
that's
I mean
huge.
that's the reality of our market. I mean, the market 20 years ago, the market was 80% Spanish dominant, which means that you're largely speaking Spanish all the time. 20 years ago. Today, it's probably more of 50-50. And so you've got, younger people that are only speaking Spanish to like their elderly, family members, but they largely speak Spanish among themselves. Like with my daughters, I largely speak to them in English. They speak Spanish, but we largely communicate in English because we've grown up in the United States. My wife and I, who's also Cuban, she and I communicate mostly in English for the most part, but again, can very easily flip from one to the other. One of the things that we're seeing also in terms of marketing is before, the only Spanish language ads that you could see were on Univision or Telemundo, right? So that was the Spanish language networks, and so those were where the Spanish language ads used to be. Today, that reality is changing. You could be watching American TV, you can be watching Fox, you can be watching, Channel 5 here in Los Angeles. You can be watching the Super Bowl, and all of a sudden, you see yourself watching an ad in Spanish, and you start thinking about it, and you go, "Wow, that's kind of odd." But it's not odd when you think about it, because what they're doing is they've got research that tells you that there are Spanish speakers watching the Super Bowl, or there are Spanish speakers watching that show on Fox. And so it's very easy to be able to say, okay, so if we've got a viewership that's Spanish, I'm going to put up a Spanish ad and get their attention. And part of marketing is really about, grabbing attention, is figuring out how do you begin to kind of, become part of the conversation. Well, I guarantee you that if you're watching the Super Bowl and you see a Spanish ad on CBS, you're going to pay attention because you're going to be kind of surprised by it. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in marketing, is trying to, bring that world to the general market and realize that there are Spanish speakers watching the Super Bowl. And so we got to communicate with them in Spanish.
That's so true. Since you brought up the Super Bowl, I got to ask, 'cause since it is in your field, what are your thoughts on the Kanye ad of him basically announcing that they spent all their money on the Super Bowl ad placement itself? So his ad was literally him holding his cell phone up and taking a selfie video and basically saying, "Click the link below and buy my shoes." What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I thought it was an interesting approach, and it's at the end of the day, I mean, these spots are so expensive. I mean, the Super Bowl is kind of it's an anomaly, right? It's an asterisk if you look at it. I mean, when you're talking about a 30-second TV spot that's anywhere between $5 and $7 million, you begin to kind of realize, wow, that's a huge opportunity if I can get to my audience, right? Because this particular Super Bowl had the second largest viewership in television, U.S. television history, only behind the landing on the moon back in like 1960, 67 or 60, 68 when that happened. So, I mean, it's amazing when you think about, the number of eyeballs that you're getting on these events. And so you have to be careful how you present yourself. But I think in today's world where everybody is, wanting to kind of, feel and touch the content themselves, pushing somebody to a link that's going to provide them with more information, that's what you ultimately want to do. You want to drive your audience. You want to mobilize your audience in order, and then to be able to kind of educate them, inform them about your particular product. So I thought it was overall pretty successful. I think a lot of the Super Bowl ads I thought were very compelling this year. I thought probably we've seen some of the better ads than we've seen in the last few Super Bowls. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that kind of authentic, kind of irreverent kind of thing that you saw also Ben Affleck and J-Lo doing something with Dunkin' Donuts. That was an irreverent type of ad, and it really, I think, struck a chord with a lot of people.
Well, that's awesome. Well, before we wrap up and everything, I want to ask a question to ask pretty much every guest. Over your extensive career and continuing to grow career, what is the best advice or the best lesson that you've learned throughout your career that you could help that young entrepreneur or that person that's getting into the entrepreneurial space?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's two things, Devin. I think the first thing is something we've already talked about, which is you got to be able to pivot. Don't be afraid to pivot your business. Like the business plan that you wrote 20 years ago might be the foundation, but that thing is not, meant to be in concrete. It's got to be a living and moving document. And so be willing to pivot, to change direction a little bit. It's not going to change the way that you approach the business, but it's going to add a new kind of dimension to it. And I think that's really important. I think the next part that's really important to me is look for mentorship, look for sponsorship, look for people that you admire, people that you can connect with, even if it's on a every couple of months, reach out and speak to them for 20, 15, 20 minutes and try to get that mentorship. Because there's a lot of people, like my age, for example, I'm almost 60 years old. So I'm ready to, probably in a few years to hang it up, but I can certainly provide younger entrepreneurs with kind of, my learnings, the ideas that I have, maybe some lessons in life that I took that worked out, and those that didn't, because not everything that I did, turned to roses. And so we got to be aware of those, and we got to be aware of the successes. And so I think those are the biggest two things: is be able to have the freedom to pivot whenever you want to. Don't be afraid to do that. I did that in my career, and then look for sponsorship or mentorship. I have a few people that I've been very close to over the years that have provided me with really great advice and counsel, and they've helped kind of guide my development. And so those to me are probably the most important two things that I would point out.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Where can people connect with you or with your agency?
Well, they could go to the my website, which is the Axis Agency, AXIS, and you can get kind of a look at the approach we have to the market. There's a bunch of commercials that we've done over the years, a lot of activation campaigns that we've done that live on that website. you can get a flavor for it and maybe learn a little bit about the Hispanic market and what the potential of that market is today and into the future.
That's awesome. I'll definitely put your website in the show notes. Guys, make sure you guys rate the episode, share it with a friend, and as always, I appreciate you guys. Thank you guys. Thank you, Armando, for taking the time and hopping on the Mindset Cafe with us today.
You bet. Thanks, Evan. Appreciate it very much.